Hola a todos y bienvenidos a una nueva Wealth Talk.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this new Wealth Talk, the series of exclusive talks for our Santander private banking clients, in which we're going to hear from experts whose knowledge is relevant for our economy, our society, and so on. A couple of details. The talk will be in Spanish, but you can hear it in English if you click on the button on the right-hand side of the screen.
Y at the right upper side of your screen. Se pueden enviar preguntas utilizando la opción de preguntas.
You may send in questions with the questions comments tab at the top of your screen, and at the end of this presentation we'll try and answer them all. Today we have with us Diego Díaz Pilas, who is Director of New Ventures at Iberdrola, and he's going to talk about our Head of Global Strategy and Private Banking. Go ahead, Juan. Thank you very much, Christina. Today, these Wealth Talks in which we try and bring you experts in different fields in order to talk about some of what we think are the most relevant trends in our society and in our economy. And I don't think there's anything more relevant now than the challenge of decarbonization, since the future of the planet is at risk. In the next 50 years, well, actually in less than 50 years, we have to manage to become carbon neutral. And to do that, we need the transition to cleaner energies. And so the future of the planet is at stake, and innovation is going to be key in order to achieve progress in this transition towards cleaner energy sources. And the goal of the talk today, well, there's 5 goals that, with Diego's help, we're trying to cover today. First, we'll talk about the current energy market, how we're consuming energy and generating energy today, and then we'll talk about the role of renewable energies in this transition towards a cleaner electricity mix. Electrification is the third item, how we can use more electricity, clean electricity for transport and industry. And we'll also talk about the costs of each of the different generation technologies and how the transition can be done in a way that will save costs. And then there's the 5th item, which is the role of innovation in all of these challenges. Diego, thank you very much for joining us today. Iberdrola is, of course, one of the leading global companies in this field of the energy transition. We're very grateful that you're taking part in this event with our clients. It's a pleasure. Good afternoon, everyone. A pleasure to be with you and your clients and to talk about the energy transition. And I hope that it will be an interesting session for everyone. Well, the first thing that we'd like to discuss is how energy is consumed today. But we've also prepared this slide which explains how this is not the first energy transition. There was an initial transition, which is where we went from using horsepower, basically, to coal. That was the first transition. And then it took us another 100 years to go through the second energy transition with oil and gas powered engines. But how long is it going to take us to get to that third energy transition based on renewable energy sources and electricity? Tell me when. Well, I think that we're actually already immersed in that process. As you said at the beginning, over the next 30 years, we have a big challenge. It's a significant social and environmental challenge, which is fully decarbonizing our economies. And today we'll see that it's not just a challenge, but also an important business opportunity. As you said at the beginning, we have gone through various energy transitions from a world in which we used the animals for power, then burnt wood, and then coal. This century we started to burn, or last century we started to burn oil and gas, whilst we continued to burn coal. And I think now we're going to stop burning things, and that's an interesting change that we're seeing today. We're going to be feeding our energy system basically with the sun, the wind, and water. And the question here is whether this transition is going to be faster than previous revolutions or transitions? Well, yes, because if we look at the slide and we look at the last 10 years, it doesn't look like it's moving very fast. The next few years, we definitely have to speed up and change the way we're consuming energy and have a radical change in our generation mix. We've prepared this slide, and perhaps you could explain it to our clients so as to explain what the current status is for energy generation and the role of electricity, because electricity is a sort of intermediate step, isn't it? That's right. The fact is, and you're correct in that although renewable energy sources have experienced exponential growth, and as we will see, they will grow even more explosively, since Iberdrola began investing in renewables 20 years ago, and they were absolutely negligible, and now they've become the most competitive energy source, as we will see in a bit more detail later. But still today, 80% of the energy that's consumed in the world comes from fossil fuels. Only 20% comes from what we would call renewable sources. Not all electricity is renewable, and there's a significant part of renewable energy that's consumed directly without going through electricity. But I think right now the headline would be 80% of the energy comes from fossil fuels still, including electricity, although there is exponential growth of renewable energy sources, which, as we will see throughout the presentation, basically wind and PV, hydro, had already acquired a very relevant role in the last few years in the different geographies. So the first challenge is to make sure that electricity has a very high percentage of clean generation, or generation from renewable sources. Yes, because there's a great difference between different countries. Even though in Europe, in countries like ours, we have up to 40% renewable energy sources in the mix, and we'll be at 70 or 80% very soon. There are other countries where the process is much slower, and the challenge is to accelerate growth in those countries, which, as we will see later, will generate a great business opportunity. We think that electricity will be decarbonized fast, and will be decarbonized because it's not just more sustainable, but also more competitive. That is, renewable sources, wind, marine wind, PV and hydro, are currently the most competitive technologies already, and they will become even more competitive in the next 10 years. And that's why the rate of decarbonization of electricity generation is going to grow tremendously in the next years. And the challenge here, and that's what you're showing in this slide now, is not just about decarbonizing electricity, because as we saw at the beginning, electricity, depending on where you are in the world, between 20 to 25% of energy consumption is electricity. And so if we decarbonize electricity fully, and we will see that we have the business and the technology to do that, but if it doesn't increase in its percentage of final energy consumption, we'll only be decarbonizing 20% of the total. If we want to decarbonize 100% of the energy system, what we need to do is increase the contribution of electricity from 20 to about 80%, and then see what we need to do with the rest. But it's key not just to decarbonize electricity generation, which is already happening, but also that we start to electrify and final energy consumption, which currently in transport, the only significant electrical part are trains. In industry, there are some elements of electricity, but it's only about a third. And in residential and buildings, there's this higher electricity percentage, but we do need electricity to grow in transport and industry, and to grow fast as we are decarbonizing electricity generation. And that's the big challenge really, to the electrification of our economy. You've explained it very well, and so depending on what we're using the energy for, we have, in the case of transport, electricity needs to compete against oil, and we'll have to see how electricity might replace fossil fuels. And for industry, it's more about replacing coal. And later we'll talk a bit more in detail, especially about how we might replace coal and get electricity to become a more prevalent source, both for industry and for residential uses. In this slide, I know that you use it in your presentations to investors, And I think it's a good summary of this challenge of the energy transition, so that the future of the planet will be more sustainable and so that we can fight climate change. Can you explain it? Yes, I would say that there are three main elements here. We have what I was just saying about decarbonizing electricity, and then we have wind energy and hydro, both direct and pumping stations. We have marine wind, we have PV, solar, and then we have final energy consumption, which is what we're saying needs to be electrified. We need electric cars, we need heat pumps. Later we'll speak a bit more about that, what that is. And in the middle, and this is very important, we have the grids. We have what enables us to transmit decarbonized electricity to the largest number of final energy uses possible. So electricity grids are a crucial part, and so we need to keep investing and automating and improving the technology in these grids, because it's what's going to enable us to go from generating decarbonized electricity to taking that electricity to all end users. And that's our vision at Iberdrola, and has been for many years, where we invest in renewables, we invest in networks and grids, and we invest in solutions for our customers. And later we'll talk about batteries, but of course renewable energy is generated with some seasonality, and that's why storage is key in order to make the full use of its potential that we need. Yes, absolutely. Okay, so this is a kind of snapshot of how energy consumption has evolved by sources. It's not a pretty picture, it's not a clean picture. You can see that we have to radically change a lot of aspects in the use and the generation of energy, so that we can meet the challenges that many countries are facing to reach net zero emissions within a reasonable period of time, before 2050, in order to achieve our emission reduction targets. I actually prefer this picture. Yes, that's the history. Okay, so this is at least what we should achieve. Or do you think that this picture, which are some estimates from Bloomberg, do you think they're realistic or not? I think actually in some cases they might even be a bit pessimistic, particularly for some geographies. We think that in countries in Southern Europe, renewable energy sources by 2030 already will represent between 70 or 75% of all electricity generation, for example. And just Iberdrola is planning to reach almost 100 gigawatts of renewable capacity by 2030. So we think that by 2030, in a lot of geographies, we'll already have around that percentage of renewable energy sources in the mix, 70-75%, which is what Bloomberg is predicting globally for 2050. But specifically for Europe, I think that we will achieve those goals much sooner. In fact, I've read in your website that in the UK, in Germany, in Portugal, Iberdrola is already generating 100% of its electricity from renewable sources. Absolutely, and that is something that doesn't just have to do with sustainability, but it's actually to do with the fact that it makes business sense, because renewable sources are currently the most competitive source for electricity generation. And so in Spain, for example, we've closed our coal-fired plants, and we're looking at the possibility of replacing them with renewable plants, particularly PV plants. And we have a very ambitious plan to invest in PV capacity and marine and land-based wind farms. And in fact, in a talk we had a few days ago, we said that maybe the picture seems a bit too biased in the direction of solar PV, but actually the picture changes when you look at energy, because solar PV produces for 2,000 hours, which are the 2,000 hours which in places like southern Spain you have sun. Land-based wind is maybe 3,000 hours, while marine wind is maybe 4,000 hours. So if we look at this pie chart in terms of energy generation, all three are necessary, with solar PV and land wind being very significant components, but marine wind being very important in those countries where that resource is available. as I was saying, in most of the geographies we operate, these are already the most competitive sources. And in Spain, we're not adding any new capacity that's not renewable, not just because it's more sustainable, but also because it makes no financial sense to do otherwise. And what you were saying the other day is about the renewable mix being very complementary because of when the electricity is generated and how it balances out your load curve. Yes, that's important because when we talk about renewable energy sources, we often talk about variability, and it's true that you have to manage that variability, and later we'll talk about storage. But first, we have improved a great deal with respect to being able to predict the capacity of the different resources, and then renewable resources are actually quite complementary. Solar is basically available during the day. Wind is flatter, although it tends to peak usually at night. And marine wind has a much flatter profile and many more hours a year. So all three are very complementary, and together with hydro and pumping stations mean that most of the energy we sell our clients in all of our geographies, most of it is generated from renewable sources. The figures you show here for capacity increases are actually pretty striking. The growth that we're going to see in the coming years is entirely different to what we saw in those earlier graphs. We're going to see an acceleration of investment, which is going to be really exponential. And a lot of it has to do with the efficiency factor and costs. This is a bit of a complicated slide, but it's very important. It shows the evolution of the costs of energy generation from renewable energy sources in the last few years compared with the costs when the energy is generated with fossil fuels. Explain to us how the costs of renewable energy production have come down so significantly, so quickly. I would say, and I wouldn't be exaggerating, that these are actually the most important graphs, certainly in the renewable energy world and definitely in the energy world nowadays, because these graphs show what is called the experience curve. And this doesn't just apply to renewable energy sources, but also to a lot of industrial processes. What this means is that as you manufacture more of a certain good, you learn and you're able to manufacture it more cheaply. In the case of solar energy, for example, whenever we double the installed capacity of solar energy in the world, the cost comes down between 25 and 30%. And what that means is, for example, that if you have 100 solar panels in the world and it costs you 10 to produce, as soon as you have 200 installed panels, it will cost us 7.5 to produce. And this, which may not sound a big difference, when you actually look at this, and of course those of you who are in finance know this, and you think of compound interest or compound rates, the impact over time is actually huge. And that's what we see in these curves. Basically, we see cost reductions in the last 10 years of solar energy of 80%, 90%. Of course, over time, as installed capacity increases, the reduction rate is harder to double. To go from 10 to 20 is easier than from 20 to 40 and from 40 to 80. But we're still, in a lot of these technologies, we're still at a very sweet spot where between now and 2030, we're going to see it double down twice. So we're going to see cost reductions in solar of an additional 30-35% to 2030. The same applies for wind, and in marine wind, because we are a bit lower in the curve, we're going to see reductions of 50-60% by 2030. And so this is the key to why this whole transition is going to accelerate so much, because the more we invest, the cheaper and the more competitive they will be. And in fact, today already, solar PV in many countries is the most competitive investment, the most efficient. It depends on the countries. In some cases it's solar PV, in others it's wind, but these are the two most competitive energy sources for electricity generation right now. It's interesting because in the case of nuclear power, It's the opposite. It is becoming increasingly expensive to generate electricity from nuclear power or to set up a nuclear power plant. Well, there are other things at stake there which have more to do with regulation and not so much with technology. It's not that we've forgotten what we have learned about nuclear power. It's just that from the regulatory perspective, it is becoming increasingly difficult. And because they're not investing more, there's no further improvements in the efficiency curve. That's right. And so what you were saying in terms of the percentage, if we look at some countries, we can see that the transition towards clean electricity is moving at an exceptional speed. Southern Europe is what you mentioned. Yes, in this graph, I think we've not included hydro, which is also renewable, but you can see that with hydro, you would add maybe an additional 10%, and so we would be at levels with countries that are close to 50% in Europe. And certainly in Southern Europe, we're going to be, again, at 70-75% very soon, which is our government's target for 2030, which we think is perfectly feasible. And in Northern Europe, 50% or so. So this is already happening. It's not a forecast that I'm making. It's something that we're already seeing that will take us to those levels in 2030. It's about maintaining our investment or accelerating that investment, but the technology is already there and it's going to be increasingly competitive. And so with current technology, we will already achieve that evolution. But of course, technology is constantly evolving at a tremendous pace. There's new discoveries every day. Can you give us some examples of how, for example, in solar energy, innovation has enabled greater efficiency? Well, yes, as I was saying earlier, in solar energy, we've been able to reduce costs by 80-90% in the last 10 years. And you might think that we might have reached the limit there. But actually, our own internal forecasts show that we've not. Innovation is actually speeding up. And traditionally, for example, solar panels collected only direct sunlight. Now we have bifacial panels, which also collect reflected light from the ground, and that means that there's increased production and therefore lower costs. And gradually we're working to reduce the quantity of material that's needed to automate production, so that in that experience curve analysis, what we saw was based in what had happened in the past. But here, if we look at innovation in the industry that's happening today, we believe that those cost reductions are going to continue, and in some areas are even going to accelerate because there's constant technology innovation. In the case of solar, it's the bifacial panels. In wind energy, as you can see here, we're moving towards larger turbines with higher towers, which are able to capture more constant wind, with larger blades, which are able to generate more electricity. You were telling me the other day in Tarifa the difference between the new towers you're building and the old ones. Yes, the usual example here is in farms that have been built in very windy parts of Spain 20 years ago. There are turbines that are maybe 800 kilowatts, and you have a farm with 200 or 300 of these, and nowadays you would only need 10 for the same capacity, or 15, and they would operate for longer hours and a tenth of the number of generators. That increases the number of hours of operation, but also reduces generation costs. In the case of solar panels, with increases in the efficiency of the panels and lower costs, and in the case of wind, with higher towers, larger generators that capture more constant wind and therefore enable you to generate electricity at a lower cost. And that trend we don't expect to decrease in the coming years. On the contrary, the industry is working on structural improvements as well as automation and other advances that will reduce the cost of wind by about 30% in the coming years, just to give you an idea. And that clearly is going to accelerate this energy transition. But earlier we said, well, we were talking about storage and batteries, but there's other technologies to store energy. Can you tell us? Yes, well, in Iberdrola, traditionally, we have 4 gigawatts pumping stations. But what are these pumping stations? It's storing electricity in a battery. But nowadays, for the electricity system, is a bit expensive. We think the cost will come down about 60% in the coming years because of the increasing demand for electricity, for electric vehicles. But we already have a mature technology today, which is pumping, which is when you have cheap electricity or electricity surplus, you can pump water upstream. Let's imagine you have 2 reservoirs, one higher than the other. When you have surplus electricity, you can pump that water to the higher reservoir, so you can then use it to go through a turbine when you need to generate electricity. This is a mature technology which we think still has potential, in fact, to make some of our hydro facilities reversible, which currently only operate one way. And we're already using them in our portfolio, and we're going to see a growing role for them in the next years. Batteries will also be used more and more in the next 10 years. They will play an increasingly important role for electricity storage, and in the future, in places where there is no pumping available, we could use hydrogen, and we can talk about hydrogen a bit later. But I think here my conclusion would be that it's true that renewable energy generation is variable over time, but it is not that big an issue, storage, because I think we have enough technology today, and we will have more. And in order to get to that 80, 85% or 90% generation from renewable energy sources, we have the technology we need. And speaking about batteries, the improvement in lithium battery technology was, of course, the reason why Stanley Whittingham and Kira Yoshino got the Nobel Prize of Chemistry. It's amazing the impact that this technology is having. Let's speak a bit about the uses of electricity beyond generation itself. Let's start with the home. I've shown a comparison here on the left of your strategy in the residential market, and also a Tesla tweet who apparently want to compete against you, since they seem to be focusing on similar uses for electricity than the ones you're developing. Could Tesla become your competitor in the future? Well, I'd say that as for the vision, going back to what I was saying at the beginning, first, so far we've talked about how you can decarbonize electricity generation, but if then electricity is only 20% of total energy consumption, we won't be able to decarbonize the whole of the system. What do we think needs to happen? We think transport needs to be electric, and we'll see some examples of what we're offering our clients with a comprehensive electric transport solutions. We think heating needs to be electric, and that's why we're offering our clients the possibility of installing HVAC systems which are the most efficient in order to decarbonize heating. And also, if our client wants to generate their own electricity, we also offer them solar panels. As far as the vision, this might be similar not just to Tesla's, but to many other of our competitors. And in that sense, I think it's a good thing that this is a shared vision. We started 20 years ago, as I said, by investing in renewables, but we welcome the fact that there are more and more companies that share that vision, because that will accelerate the process and also confirm the fact that we're on the right track to offer profitable goods and services to our clients with the electricity grid that is required so that we can electrify demand and decarbonize. I think Tesla's vision has mostly been focused on transport to begin with, and they focused on electric transport much sooner than other car manufacturers, and that has, I think, encouraged their peers to move in the same direction. And we definitely welcome their developments in other areas. We don't think they're going to be a consistent competitor, but we do have a shared vision.
Good. Let's talk a little bit about the electrification of transport and talk about the uses let's advance more in the short term. Here we see the sales of electric cars in the main markets. In Europe, we are seeing an acceleration. This is picking up, but until now it's not been a radical change. What's your vision, your long-term vision? Well, I think there are fundamentally three drivers here that make this grow more or less. One is the regulatory issues, sustainability and what have you. We see more and more countries and cities that are committing to promoting electric transport instead of fossil fuel transport. The second lever is the competitiveness of electric cars and vehicles, and this is growing more than other areas. An electric vehicle today is more expensive in terms of buying the vehicle, and that is a fact, and all consumers know. When you go to the dealer, the electric car is more expensive. But when we talk about total operation costs of the vehicle throughout its life, including fuel and maintenance, well, it's more or less the same. And in certain applications, people that drive a lot, taxis, some urban applications, electric cars are beginning to be competitive. And we think that by about 2025, they will be competitive in terms of right from the start. And that is going to trigger growth of sales. Here you see on this graph. But these are the projections of experts. Do you think this will grow faster? 2030 maybe could be the key date. Well, no, we see that by 2030 we'll have 130 million electric vehicles in our streets, and that sales in certain areas will be huge. We see that right now we see exponential growth. If you go to certain countries like Norway, we're talking about 60-70% electric cars. In Europe. The sales are doubling and trebling quarter on quarter. We see an exponential growth up to 25, and after 25, the impact is going to be even greater in terms of the global percentages. And well, this is like renewables, batteries. There are experience curves of experience, and batteries are probably going to become much cheaper over the next few years, and they will even be cheaper at some stage, maybe from the start. Yes, if we look at this, we used to look at how long it took for the installed capacity of solar power to double. Well, we say from now until 2030, there'll be two jumps, two leaps. It's going to double, and double again. In the case of batteries, talking about 10 leaps or jumps ahead. The installed capacity is going to double 8-10 times. So that means a reduction in costs of 60-70%. And as I said, after 25, electric vehicles are going to be more expensive initially, in the initial investment. Up until 25, but later they will be much more competitive for the final user. For certain users, they are already competitive, and for most users after 25, they will be totally competitive. So basically, you're saying if we've got a customer that makes exhaust pipes, for instance, they should change their business plan, should they not? Well, I wouldn't go as far as that. Maybe I wouldn't give that advice. But yes, we see that mobility is going to be electric, mainly electric, and this is important. And this is not an issue of sustainability, or not just sustainability. It's costs and competitiveness. This is the main message here. We're not talking about we've got to buy electric cars and vehicles because of the emissions. Of course, they don't. The emissions are important, but in certain terms, they're more competitive, and in the long term, they're going to be more competitive over the next 4 or 5 years. In all areas, yeah, we see that every year the estimated percentage of sales of electric cars goes up and up, and probably over the next few years we're going to see figures that are even higher. This radically changes the way we recharge our batteries and recharge our energy devices. We spoke about the public apps for charging devices and cars and vehicles, and how user-friendly this app is. How many have we got in Spain? How many points of supply? Well, our app we have for our customers 15,000 points throughout Europe, not just Spain, but through partners. 15,000 points of recharge in Europe of supply. We have three levers. The environment regulation that is going to increase, get more and more strict, and then competitiveness, and the third lever, infrastructure for recharging your car. If you buy a car, you probably recharge it at home, but it's important if I go on a journey, on a trip, I need to know that I have a point of recharge that is available to me. It will be less often because the minute I buy an electric car, I practically haven't used a public point of recharge, but it must be there, it must be available, this charging point. Iberdrola, we have 15,000 points available on our app, and for 2024 we aim at having 150,000, both public and private, deployed. We're talking about figures that are very significant, and I think that this is not just Iberdrola committed to this. We've got 15,000. We've really sped up, but I think it's a trend, a growing trend in all markets, and we've got to speed up. We've got to favour this, but it's regulation, competitiveness, availability of infrastructure. Those are the three areas. In the third area, infrastructure, we have that, we're deploying that for our customers, but very soon it will be available to everybody. Yes, we've got to speed up, and we've got to speed up to not lag behind other economies like the Chinese economy. In China, in December, they installed 100,000 new charging points, which is more than the whole stock of charging points in the US, and they are really in a different league. China is one of the most polluting countries in the world, but they've recently taken on the challenge for net zero levels of pollution by 2050, and they are realizing that this is a huge business and an area where if they invest early, thanks to the learning curve that you mentioned, they might have the supremacy in terms of competitiveness in the near future. Yes, China, it's true, it's a country, it's almost a continent. The magnitude, the dimensions are huge. I mean, in Europe, we've got to speed up, but this is a tremendous opportunity, not just for infrastructure, setting up infrastructure, but all the associated industries, and we can talk about this. But we, for instance, we've got as a partner, and we're investors in the company, a company like Volvox. They produce solutions for charging infrastructure, and this is not just an opportunity for the final customer, but also in terms of industrialization in Europe. I think this is important. We should continue. We should not lag behind, and it's a huge opportunity from the point of view of industrialization and not just the final user, but the point of view of creating our own industry in Spain, in Europe, etc. Yes, let's go now to the last section, which is the most complex in terms of electrification, heavy industry and heavy transport. What do you think the transition is going to be like in those sectors? Well, there are two questions in one there. Regarding transport, we think that light vehicles medium-sized vehicles are going to be electrified. Lorries and trucks will probably also go electric. We've got the technology, we've got the sources of energy, and heavy transport, road transport is also going to go electric. In the case of ships and planes, certain areas can go electric, but long-haul flights and that kind of thing is more complicated. We've got fuels like hydrogen that come or can be produced based on renewable energy. We'll talk about hydrogen and how, in terms of costs, can help us to decarbonize the sectors and industries that can't go electric. We think that more than 80% of activity can go electric, but there's a 20% that can't. And that 20% you got solutions like hydrogen. If we can work on that, and we're working on that at Iberdrola to reduce its costs significantly, that will be an alternative to reach that net zero level. But hydrogen, the issue, we need higher. Is it going to be more efficient? Is that going to allow us to electrify that 20%? It's not that hydrogen is more competitive than electricity, but there are some industries where they can't go electric due to technological reasons. If you want to decarbonize those industries, you've got hydrogen at Iberdrola. We want to set up 500 megawatts by 2025. 3,000 megawatts by 2030, and we got a unit devoted to that, and that can make us reach 100%. It's important here to talk about hydrogen, renewable hydrogen, because it wouldn't make sense to produce that with gas or coal and emit CO2, because then that would defeat the purpose. We wouldn't be reducing emissions. And that green hydrogen, that renewable hydrogen, which you see on this slide, can be competitive against grey hydrogen, which is produced with fossil fuels. And it can be competitive quite quickly because the costs of production, renewable production, are going to come down. The capacity is going to increase. Renewables are going to be used longer, and prices, the electrolyzers are going to come down. They're the systems where we put electricity and water in and to produce hydrogen. So this green hydrogen is what will allow us to go from that 80% electric to net zero, 100% decarbonized, which is the final goal that we have globally. And it's going to play a very important role in industry, in maritime and air transport. So what you're saying is that thanks to the interaction of innovation first in terms of generating renewable electricity, innovation in storage and batteries, and innovation in the use of hydrogen for those industries that are difficult to electrify, the combination of those three factors will allow us to arrive at net zero. Yes, correct. We have the technology. We have to continue to work on this. We have to, as we did at Iberdrola 20 years ago, we have to really, within the industry and the world, we have to speed up, because we have the technology to decarbonize electricity. We have technology with the batteries, electric vehicles, and heat pumps to electrify transport and heating of homes. We've got technology to electrify part of the industry, and where we can't, we can do it indirectly by using green hydrogen, for instance. And it's not only that we have the technology, this is the right time to speed up, because you said at the beginning, 50% you spoke about. We've got 30. We've got 2030. Sorry, 2030. 2030 and is the date, and it's now 2021. But till 2050, we've got 30 years, 3 decades. We've got the technology to do it. We've got the technology to electrify the supply of electricity, of energy, of power. These are the slides where you see the commitment of Iberdrola to green transition and energy transition. We see examples of how you've done away with coal plants and how you have got ahead of your competitors and you're committed to 2030. And recently, we also, at the Santander Group, have taken the first steps towards our corporate commitment to speed up this change. But I was chatting to you the other day, and we were talking, if you remember, about some of these things, and I see that this is not just a need of society, it's not just a question of commitment, it's a tremendous, a huge business opportunity, doing things differently, generating new uses, new forms of in many of the value chains and the uses that we have, transport and heating and everything. So it really is a tremendous opportunity to invest in this change. It's not just a need, it's an opportunity. Yes, I would say that decarbonisation and electrification of the economy is a tremendous business opportunity, and also for industrialisation. It's an opportunity for the final user because these technologies are more efficient and operationally cheaper, and it's also important in terms of industrialisation. And I'm talking about Spain, Europe, other countries. We think that as these value chains develop, that leads, as I said before, to new innovative companies that create new industrial and digital services and products. And what we think is that this is not just a question, it's not just a need in terms of environmental sustainability, but an enormous opportunity. Well, Diego, you're very clear in the way you've presented everything. Sorry that I interrupted you. We had so many things to talk about. But now we have questions, and I got questions through the WhatsApp channel from customers. Let's start with a question that's a bit, well, it's a hot question right now in Spain, because we're talking about making electricity cheaper, and the prices of electricity have just gone up, and this is very controversial. Why has this happened, or is it just a one-off thing? Well, no. I think we're talking about structural issues. We haven't analyzed each and every period of time in recent years, but the trend is that renewable electricity is going to get cheaper in the long run, and finally, undoubtedly, power will become cheaper, but there might be situations, temporary situations like this. But in the long run, it's going to get cheaper. And this afternoon, I was speaking to my team about increased prices, for instance, panels, and this has to do with the offer and supply and demand, sorry. And in the long run, it's going to get cheaper. In the long run, it's going to get cheaper. This is the structural trend in terms of competitiveness. There might be temporary increases, but in the long run, it's going to get cheaper. So in the long run, the trend that we're not going to pay more for our energy. Is that right? Because the consumer will benefit from these advances in efficiency. Yes, that's correct. Another question that has to do with the solar panels. I'm being asked about renewable energies. They're more metal consumption intensive. Copper, lithium, nickel, all that has gone up a lot, the consumption of those metals. So will this mean this increased demand, will that increase the demand in commodities, and is that going to cause a bottleneck? Very good question. Your customers are very they really are with it. They know what's going on. Well, we're going from a system, as we've seen in the presentation, we go from a system that is based on burning things with initial costs that are lower and operational costs, environmental and economic, that are very high, however, to a system where the initial costs are higher and therefore there's a greater consumption of raw materials. That is right. That is right. However, the second part is, that is correct. The premise is correct. Renewables and electrification of the economy increase the use of certain minerals. Yes, that is true. But we think, and this is probably more important, there are no problems in terms of reserves of those materials. This growing demand, which is going to increase, nickel, cobalt, lithium, there's going to be an increased demand, and we must adjust production to that demand. There might be increases in prices, as historically has happened with all commodities when there's an increased demand, until the production capacity is in line with the demand. What we don't have is a problem in reserves. We got more than enough of these materials. That could cause a bottleneck, but no, that bottleneck would be temporary. Well, I wouldn't speak about a bottleneck. I would say that I would talk about price spikes, but temporary. And in this case, there's an increase in terms of what reserves are available and what reserves are being used and exploited. An advantage here is that although today these minerals are being used more, but the reserves of these minerals are well distributed and spread throughout the world, and they're going to offer new business opportunities to many countries, not just the traditional fossil fuel countries, but many other countries. Good. A question regarding whether it's necessary to set up more renewable energies, because the customer is asking, the power is 10 gigawatts in Spain, consumption 30, electric consumption in Spain has been going down in the last 24 months. Is this a temporary thing, or what is it? No, I think it's important to clearly distinguish. This is very technical. We're getting very technical. One thing is the installed capacity, and another thing is the average power, peak power of the system. We are moving towards a system where renewables operate on average for a certain amount of hours, and we're going to need more installed capacity to cover the demand. That means that doesn't mean that it's going to be more expensive, because the cost of the unit cost with those technologies is lower. So it is true that we're going towards a system where we're going to have greater installed capacity. Gradually the fossil capacity is going to go down and the renewable capacity is going to go up, and we have to adjust the installed capacity in line or in terms of the needs of the system. Yes. Another question which might be a bit technical but has to do with hydrogen. A customer asks, there's an energy loss of 30% with hydrogen, and it produces vapor emissions into the atmosphere and would contribute to global warming. Tell us about this, and also about batteries. How are batteries recycled? Don't we run the risk of causing new problems for the planet and the atmosphere because of these new ways of generating power? Well, the first question about hydrogen. Hydrogen, yes, it has an efficiency issue. When you've got a unit of electricity and you produce hydrogen in energy terms, you've lost not just 30, I would say almost 40% you lose. And then when you consume that hydrogen, you have more losses. That is why hydrogen is only good for those industries where can't be electrified. That's why I said hydrogen is good for those industries that cannot be electrified. The optimal situation to prevent those losses would be to have direct electrification. So hydrogen would only be used in those industries. Doesn't make sense where electricity can't be used. As regards to the second question, batteries are fully recyclable, and we have technologies today that will develop as demand needs it to develop to recycle those batteries. So we can't compare the potential environmental problem of recycling batteries with CO2 emissions and what that means to the planet. We're talking about two completely different worlds. One is a problem, a challenge that we have to optimize, like we recycle much of our waste. We're going to recycle batteries too. And we've got to stop, on the other hand, burning fossil fuels if we don't want to destroy the planet. So the orders of magnitude are completely different. Yes, another question about the Brazilian market. I don't know whether you're familiar with it, because you're more of you're in charge of innovation at Iberdrola, and I don't know whether you're familiar with the local markets. talking about generation of energy in Brazil. I don't know whether you're familiar in detail. Well, in Brazil, there's a lot of hydraulic energy. It's a country that has a high level of renewable energy because of its natural resources, very high. It's a country that, from the point of view, when we looked at the picture, the level of renewables, Brazil is off the charts. And they're growing even more in solar, wind. So from the point of view of electricity, they're going to be even more off the chart. They're a country that, from the point of view of renewables, hydraulic especially, they historically and currently are really well ahead. Well, we've covered a lot of ground. We've had questions from customers. We can't go beyond 60 minutes. We got 2 minutes, and I want you to give me a final tweet to summarize what is most important for you in terms of energy transition. 140 characters. We could talk about this for hours, but to synthesize this in a single tweet, let's see if I can do it in 140 characters. But the summary, fundamental summary, is that energy transition is not just a need, it is an enormous business and industrialization opportunity. I don't know if I've exceeded the 140 characters, but I would say it's important. This is not just about the environment. Competitiveness of this technology allows us to turn that need into a huge business opportunity. That, for me, is the message, the summary. We'll count the characters later. I think maybe it's 140, maybe 150, but that's the summary. Yeah, I think it was perfectly summarized. I just got a final question. 3 minutes before we finish. Let's see if you can answer in 2 minutes. It's a very good question. Prices of electricity, they're political because they have tariffs in different countries. So the question is, nuclear, hydraulic, coal, energy, are they amortized? How do you explain those prices? Is it sunken prices versus variable prices and costs? Is that going to influence the transition and its speed? Well, that question is not for 2 minutes. I would need hours to answer that question. I think it's important to not get confused here. There are regulatory and specific situations in different markets, like we've spoken about today, but the cost of our electricity bill, quite a significant percentage of that has to do with tariffs and taxes and things that have nothing to do with technology. What I would say is that if you focus on the hidden costs, and you don't commit to new technologies, you're going to lose the advantages of being a first mover and generating that learning curve. If we wait too long and say, no, we've got to amortize the past, maybe the Chinese will overtake us on the right and become leaders in new technologies. Yes, totally, absolutely. I think that in Spain and Europe, from the point of view of renewable energies, we're in a very good position. We have committed early, and we have to continue with our commitment to make this an opportunity, not just to decarbonize electricity, but to reindustrialize Europe and lead the change in Europe. Well, 1859 in Spain, 1 minute to 7 in Spain in the evening. I think Christina, we've covered the goals that we had. I wanted to thank Diego for his part, for being with us, for explaining things so complex matters. It's a pleasure. Thank you very much. Well, on my part, that's all. I just have to say goodbye. Thank Diego and Juan for their participation. It's been fascinating. It's been phenomenal. And all our customers for joining us. It is a pleasure to have these talks and to provide you with more knowledge and expert opinion on different issues and topics through these Wealth Talks. You have the Wealth Talks available on our website, and we'll see you the next time. Thank you very much. Thank you. Goodbye.